Welcome to this conversation of mine with OG Rose. It's always nice to have you.
I enjoy it very much. Absolutely.
You have seen also you have seen my latest conversation with Guy Sengstock on the Eye of Charity.
Loved it. Yep.
Which might tie in a little bit with what we are talking about today, because for me, so we will talk about practicing and philosophical practices. And perhaps for me, when I started reading Nishitani and his strong emphasis on kenosis and so self-emptying, and where he really develops towards the end of Religion Nothingness, he develops this notion of love and agape. This is also very important for John Vervaeke. And the issue is, suddenly with Heidegger, I would say, when Heidegger gave his famous speech on what is metaphysics, and he talked about the nothing, which really angered a lot of logical positivists such as Carnap, and kind of, a lot of people were really mystified by what Heidegger, what is he going on? What's going on? But he will say later that the Japanese people who then also translated this immediately understood what he was talking about with the nothing. So my proposal is that this nothing as such, this element of nothingness, is really, and this groundlessness, so that we are not in the metaphysical anymore, where we have a stable ground and we can all agree on that ground, but suddenly something broke forth, which is really a non-ground or withdrawing ground, an up ground, and with that element suddenly becoming flagrant or coming out into the open and wanting to be acknowledged by philosophy, and in the West, Heidegger doing this, I think what also has to change, let's say in this period where we are now with, let's say, late modernity and let's say the end of subjectivity and subjectivity becoming more and more confused, and also our attempts of affirming subjectivity in, let's say, the virtual realms, where, in my opinion, it becomes more and more schizophrenic. So that we leave this element of subjectivity behind and enter into this new element of nothingness and learn how to pragmatically and practically address it, also with new practices, which would then be beyond, let's say, beyond the modern, let's say, or the modern scheme, which has as the pillars really Descartes' ego cogito, subjectivity, and all forms of, the will to power, the will to will, and so on.
No, outstanding. And Mrs. Ruba, always a thrill and delight to speak with you. So thank you for the chance. I think, once we start talking about nothingness, well, that's so close to nothing. And how do you experience the difference between nothing and nothingness? Well, that's going to have a lot to do with conditioning and practices, indeed. And you see, the issue becomes that in the West, we so often kind of foundationally with our philosophy operate with being versus nothing. And we define value according to what isn't nothing. And nothing is kind of evil, right? There's these associations of nothing with evil and bad and so on and so forth. And indeed, there is a sense, if it's coming from like a Christian metaphysic, that nothingness is a kind of privation of being, right? However, there's also an apophatic tradition where nothingness is nothing because it transcends the capacities of the human subject to fully grasp it. Maybe, so now there are different debates in apatheticism. You can say, like, if you believe in Christianity that God is apophatic, you can say, well, he's knowable but not completely knowable, or you can say he's not knowable and not completely knowable. Like, there are different debates on what degree that can get into, and that gets into a lot of different things: kaphatic, apophatic, Aquinas, Karl Barth, all these different debates. But that's an entire debate. But regardless, if you start to say that actually there's something about being human that is about coming to terms with no thingness, of which then may actually contain a fullness of being, not an absence of being, well, then how do we condition ourselves to experience more of that versus less of that? And then also have the emotional and psychological ability to handle and accept the fact that we can never complete that work because it is apathetic. So this is a very different kind of philosophy. Whereas if we have a philosophy that's simply, say, trying to get presuppositionless knowledge or the transcendent non-conditional truth, all of that is kind of very solid, right? Like if you find it, you're done. And really, this conditioning the subject is beside the point, because the transcendent truth is true regardless of the conditioning of the subject, right? It's objective. Well, if you're talking today about a philosophy that says, well, that effort for a ground, a transcendent ground, is misguided and it's problematic, well, there's two responses to that. One, postmodern nihilism, maybe, where you just give up and say, well, I guess we're doomed, and you just kind of fall into all of that. Or you say, almost in a kind of Hegelian inversion of Kant's noumenon, where you kind of flip it and say, the very fact that you have the antinomies of reason is actually the strength of reason. Likewise, you go, wait a minute, if thought is incapable of grounding itself, maybe that's not what thought is in the business of doing. Maybe thought is instead in the business of conditioning itself to better grasp no thingness and to find more to think in that no thing. So you take the loss of ground, and the way I mentioned it to a guy the other day who I love, and I loved your talk on charity, is I kind of think about it as the difference between searching for presupposition or trying to find the correct grounding to intersupposition, where you're looking for kind of the new way to hold together your worldview or your thinking in the between space between you and others, of which, when the thing is about between spaces, we know they're not nothing. Like when you're in a room with someone and you're not speaking, is there nothing going on? Oh, there tends to be a whole lot going on, actually, right? Maybe you're not speaking because you're so in love with one another you don't need words, or maybe you're not speaking because you're mad at one another. The nothing is not nothing. Now, the question is, do you meet the conditions of being able to rightly interpret that nothing, right? Or not? What we're getting at is that to experience nothing as no thingness requires a conditioning, right? And you see, I think what ends up happening is when in Heidegger's early work, in the West, there's not really been a culture of practicing or conditioning. We've thought about subjective, object, subject, object. So the idea that the subject conditions himself in a manner to experience nothing as no thingness, and therefore a possibility space that conditions the subjects, that condition the possibilities back and forth, that's kind of a new thought, right? And so, but you see, it's kind of funny because precisely now the lack of the tenableness of the possibility of a ground is kind of something that's forcing us to consider the intersuppositional, right? That's forcing us to consider dialogos. So it's kind of like, it's almost like a good thing. It's almost like, they say like creativity is birthed by necessity. Like when all options run out, you start to have to be creative. It's almost like, it's kind of like all of the failure of grounding and then all the horrible cynical nihilism and irony that has resulted from that. Everyone's like, well, we got to do something else. And so there's sort of an innovation of thought, which I do think has turned into Eastern thought, or things like dialogos, which is a notion. What's so interesting about like the circling of the dialogos, and then I'll give it back to you, is like you really are dealing with a no thingness, because when I'm alone in the room, everything around me is practically a kind of space, right? A kind of nothingness. But what emerges between people is not nothing of the same character. Right? It's a nothing where there's literally something going on between. So it's almost like the presence of people transforms nothingness into no thingness, and actually unveils the possibility that nothingness is always no thingness. It's just in that interpersonal experience that you get the horizon to think of all nothing, even the nothing in this room, as possibly a no thingness, right? Like if you ever in your life, and I mentioned this to guys, see a green cat, the world is forever a place where cats can be green, right? Well, likewise, if in the space between two people you experience that nothing can be no thingness, then it's possible for all nothing and all experiences, even outside of circling or interaction, to actually be no thingness. So there's a kind of revelation that can emerge between people that then can be carried into all areas. And that seems to be, but right there, you see, what that's though saying is that our horizons are relative to certain experiences, Whereas the West kind of says like, no, the truest horizon or the way to interpret the world or understand the world is not conditional. It's not conditioned by having certain experiences. But today what we're kind of saying is like, no, to have like the correct horizons, you have to put yourself in the place of certain experiences and certain practices, and then carry the horizons you learn from those places to the rest of your life, as opposed to you're just able to find them in any condition at any time, universally, non-conditionally. So I think that's a massive change in Western thought, to move from, say, object, subject to condition. You know, I call it like objectivism, subjectivism, and today what we're kind of saying is a kind of conditionalism, where you condition yourself by certain practices and you discover new horizons and certain conditions that you can then carry to other areas. And that would include nothing actually being nothingness. That would be horizon you carry to the rest of your entire life.
I mean, what I hear in conditioning is also finitude in some sense, the realization that we're not infinite and we can, but that we have to make concrete decisions and kind of like shape the inexhaustible possibility into concrete actions, concrete lives, basically. Yes. And yeah, so there's always this going on. Now for Heidegger, you know, art was so important. Art, kind of like the job of the artist is kind of like standing in this element of nothingness and birthing it in its truth. So giving it, so to say, giving it kind of a place in the work of art, so it can sway this truth of what he called being. And we have talked about art, right? I just referencing my early conversation with on Tanizaki and on Japanese aesthetics. I think they also, the Japanese art forms, like these arts that come out of Zen Buddhism, I think they attempt very well the attempt character of art. So not just, right, you don't want to give kind of like a representation of reality, or you want to give perhaps what you perceive in an object, but you really want to try to attempt these like flower arrangement, for example. You just attempt to put that thing in its truth, so to say, to let it appear in its suchness, and you make an attempt, and then after you make the next attempt, and so on, and in Japan that really that attempt character is very strong. So it's always going on, so to speak. The errantry in art. I have other things that before we've cut off, and I don't, because I think it's confusing, but let's, do you have something on what I've just said?
No, well, there's something about art that in of itself is a kind of conditionalism, because there is a logic and a structure to art. Like, that's why we'll talk about stories failing that are deus ex machina. Like if you have Lord of the Rings and aliens show up, that doesn't make any sense, and that would be a bad story because it doesn't match the logic of the story. And so when you create a story, you create certain conditions of which then have to unfold from those initial conditions in a manner that makes sense. So really what is the key is, I think, understanding conditionalism, or the logic of intersupposition or dialogus, is to think of it in terms of kind of the structure of art. Like the art has a kind of objective structure, but the objective structure is created, right? It is not pre-existing. It has to be the writer brings it together, thinks it all together, and puts it together. And that makes possible the experience of the art. So what I call kind of the phenomenology of the artist, or the experience of making art, or the experience of doing art, definitely has an intersuppositional character to it. And it definitely has a conditional character. So I don't think it's by chance that when Heidegger is understanding nothingness, or he's understanding, like, he's getting into art, he's getting into poetry, because there is a way where this discloses being in a new way. And really, the way that it kind of discloses being in a new way is disclosing it as a product of conditionalism, not a subject-object divide. Being is disclosed relative to conditions, relative to the practices you carry out and put yourself in. art also is a kind of practice. You practice to get better and better. And here's the other thing about that. Your ability to do art well is relative to the time and practice and work you do, right? So likewise, the way being discloses itself is relative to the work and time and practice that you do. So it's better at disclosing itself. You can't just discover, like the idea that in the West you've had is, if we find the right philosophy, we'll discover being. Boom, there it will be. Boom. So now we have a new setting. We had a technical problem there, and Zaruba in his goodness has worked with me to make it happen because he's a saint. So we'll resume on what we were saying. So I love the tree. That tree is really cool, Zaruba. And yeah, on my end, the electricity went out and different things. So the joys of modern life. Anyway, yeah, I mean, for a very long time, I think science and objectivity, it's kind of like, oh, if you find being, or like the best horizon of being, or whatever, or truth, you just find it and it's there. Well, the artist teaches you, like, art is a skill. The more you do it, the more you can condition different arts. You can have different horizons of experience. And really what we're finding now, precisely because we're almost forced due to the loss of the possibility of ground, is to think about encountering being in terms of a conditioning, a certain way of carrying ourselves in the world. And that's very different, because then indeed, the kind of way that being discloses itself to us is very much relative to what we practice and what we experience and how we condition ourselves. It's not non-contingent. Like someone like me or someone else, in the same way that it's not like relative to say that different writers who do different practice and different trainings will write in different ways, right? That's not relative. Like in terms of skill, yeah, it's clear that people who train in different ways or for different amounts of time or have different experiences will produce differently according to that skill, right? That's not relativism. That's just the reality of things. We see that in art. And so likewise, the way being discloses itself, or the horizons that we encounter, are relative to the practices and the conditions we put ourselves through. And that's not to reduce it to subjectivity, that's to reduce it to the notion of certain conditions that we meet. So I think like art as really a kind of central way or skill is really quite important. And then of course in Dialogos, that gets into like the art of conversation, right? That gets in the art of being open to the other person, the way of participating. And we start seeing as an art form, and there really is, I think, maybe in modernity, we came to think of communication as simply the sharing of data, sharing of information. But before that, you have like oration as a skill, like present rhetoric as a kind of conversation. And what's interesting is it's almost like kind of a new rhetorical orational skill in Dialogos, which is more emergent as opposed to just presentational. Right? You know, it's almost like in classical oration, you'd have, Cicero, whoever, giving a presentation. But now there's something that's very interesting because it's like an intersuppositional act and also a certain way of holding ourselves in the world. So I do think, I do think going the thinking in terms of art can be quite helpful.
Yeah, I mean, for example, also psychoanalysis, like they consider themselves that's an art form. It's close, because that's just one example. They were always in between science and art and kind of like thinking, what are we actually? And many think of themselves as more an art form, because you cannot, when you structure dialogue in a very concise way that's perhaps repeatable, like if you would do an interview, and that doesn't work. You won't find out much about the other person when you do it like in an interview form, where we have like always the same questions. And it's an art form to educe. So Guy and me, we often use this word, like educe something from the person, get to the depths of the person. And so with nothingness, there's this interesting, or with the groundless element, there's this interesting notion what John Vervaeke calls reciprocal opening, in a sense that there's a constant exaption of cognitive functions or of anything. We never get to the bottom of the self When we think we have it, and we realize at some point we are puzzled again, we don't have it. And so it is with many things. So silence, for example, when you're like a materialist or so, like you could say, oh, the silence in the art of dialogue is just there's just nothing, nothing's going on. But we all know that's not true. This is the point you made before a long break. And silence inevitably becomes, through this art of dialogue, it becomes more than silence. Kind of like becomes the horizon into which we can grow and into which we can kind of like, into which this art of the dialogue can blossom, almost like a tree or a plant. And that blossoming, when we do it in the right spirit, is just we just participated, and it goes on and opens and opens and opens and opens. And that's also I think close then to when the Greeks talked about the initial attunement of philosophy as being in wonder. I think when we can learn again to find that attunement as human beings, to be in constant wondering about what's going on and being amazed by that, and having the right practices to participate in that wonder, then that would be a good way to solve what we call the meaning crisis today.
Oh no, absolutely. Well, and the thing is too, so what's always amazing to me is kind of the wonder of when you sit down to write a story or to do a paper, how it almost like ideas you never had before emerge and they sort of appear. And there's kind of a wonder of how stuff just kind of happens, right? And that wonder, when I think about the wonder of philosophy, there's the wonder that's also kind of the, oh wow, I thought I knew what justice was, and then I find out I have no idea. And then an additional wonder of, wow, once I start thinking about it and do it with other people, like all these new concepts and ways emerge from that. So there's like the wonder of the, oh my gosh, everyday life is crazy. And how do we occupy, like, how do we carry ourselves in the world when we really don't know what we're doing, and yet we somehow do it? That's kind of a strange wonder that we do that. And then the wonder of examining what's underneath that everydayness and how it can blossom and blossom and blossom, right? So likewise, when you sit down to do a story and your characters like come alive and start feeling like they're not you, they're their own people, there's a kind of wonder of that. And likewise in conversation, there's the wonder that occurs when the dialogue gets a life of its own, right? Where it takes off. All of these seem to have kind of like, when philosophy is about wonder, it seems to have that wonder of being struck by the suchness of life. There's the wonder of, man, we occupy in our everydayness, really not knowing what our basic terms mean. There's a wonder there. And then there's a wonder of these things that can surprise, that can come up, that can emerge. Characters can be alive, dialogues can come alive when you get the right conditions. And all of those kind of forms of wonder, if you have those experiences, then changes the horizon by which you experience life. And if you experience life in those terms, well, then, like you say, that can go a long way for the meaning crisis, right? I think it also shows that there's something about surprise that can be part of life. And if surprise, there's always, it's like Guy and Chris and Dr. Vivek were talking about hope. If there's always surprise, there can also be hope. Now, there can also be terror, because something surprising can occur that's bad, right? And that's why I think when we talk about emergence, we also have to condition ourselves and kind of have a courage for what may emerge, right? That's why I talk about the cipher in that piece, because sometimes in dialogos, it's like a surprising thing kind of pops up and like, oh, what am I going to do now? And you also have the courage to let life disclose itself in surprising ways. So there's also a courage element to it. And I think that's important with the emergent, like a lot of the talk of kind of the emergence on the wonder, because it's not necessarily the case that the emergence will take care of itself or do something that you even want disclosed to yourself. And also, I think in the eye of charity notion, like it's really, really hard to see the good in someone. Or if you're, if you're Ivan Karmosov, I mean, he's like, look at these children being tortured. How can you possibly have the eye? That's what Dr. Hart was talking, David Bentley Hart was kind of talking about as an answer to the problem of evil. Well, there's a kind of courage to be able to have the eye of charity of, maybe I'm deluded, right? Maybe I'm delusional. And you have to face that possibility precisely to then carry yourself in such a way that conditions the people around you to actually see that New Jerusalem or the beauty of the world despite the evil. But that has to come with the risk of going, oh, am I delusional, right? Or likewise, if you step into a dialogos and you're willing to have the conversation, like, am I crazy? What do I mean something's going to happen that I don't even understand? Am I nuts? There's a kind of courage in that. Likewise, if you shatter your everydayness, to see the wonder, that can entail a kind of terror because it's how you operate in the world. And now, it's like all the existentialists say philosophy is terrible for you because it makes you existential. So there's a element of a courage that I think comes into this. And then also there's a funny thing because, like, if you don't have the skill to say, glass blow, if I'm just making like to deal with fire, then you really shouldn't, right? Because you might get hurt, right? So then there actually is something about skill development of which then requires for the courage to be backed and be and not just foolishness, right? Because if you start doing philosophy, like what in a sense has kind of occurred, there's a way to look at the 20th century as people doing philosophy without intersuppositional thinking, without conditionalism, and they ended up in nihilism. Because philosophy without this kind of change that we're talking about can end up in a deconstructionist pulling everything apart, right? So you need the right skills, the right thinking about philosophy to not end up that way. So there is something, but once you know that, then it's an act of the courage of stepping into the space of shattering the everydayness, interacting with people intersuppositionally, so that you can have that wonder occur, of which then gives hope, right? Because it would mean that there's surprise. And if there's surprise, then there's possibility. And if there's possibility, there can be hope. And that's not just future hope, that conditions you now. Because that possibility is now. It can occur now if you step into those horizons. So I definitely think it can address. And again, it does, like the eye of charity is such a good example because it goes to show you how the way you choose to see what is in front of you transforms what it means to you. And if it changes what it means to you, it changes how you treat it, which then may treat it, which may change it, which meant feedback loop to you, and it goes on and on and on. I would say that's the other component of the philosophy that's intersuppositional, is that it's very feedback loop. It really understands kind of a reciprocity. A kind of the way you see the world changes the world, which changes you, which changes the world, that changes you. Now, I associate that with Hegel's absolute, everything that is the case plus you, as opposed to a Wittgensteinian truth, the world is everything that is the case. Because in that kind of Wittgenstein notion there, although I like Wittgenstein, you don't have the involvement of the subject conditioning the world, which conditions the subject back and forth and back and forth. And I think what we're seeing is how that's at play in intersuppositional thinking.
The very last thing that you said reminded me strongly of this Buddhist idea of the dependent origination, where you realize, right, you're not kind of like an isolated self, but you realize that you are conditioned by everything, and you also, in a sense, you also make the world. The self also makes the world. And there's this constant reciprocity, this interpenetration going on. And I think the eye of charity can, when you think like all these other suffering beings, they are part of myself, then and you cultivate that eye within you, then of course you the way you act in the world also is transformed. That's of course. The thing with the silence, or with the nothing, right? The bivalence, right? The kind of like John Levesque often talks about, like we have to cultivate a taste for this nothingness, in a sense that because because it can be so uncanny. So we often we don't even have to talk about nothingness. Just think about when we face something we don't know yet. same thing applies. And we need a kind of, we need courage, and we might need other virtues just in order to face that forthrightly. But with this negative element, I think it's also, there's this peculiar terror. Heidegger called it anxiety, right? He talked about the what is metaphysics? He talked about anxiety. So there's nothing puts us into a kind of attunement of anxiety, because we don't know what it is. And that's of course not so nice. So, but we have ways, and we learn this from, for example, the apophatic tradition, I think Platonic tradition. I think they are very good in teaching us how to come to terms with that element.
It's a cat. The cat attacked. The cat attacked.
No, something like it was. I don't actually know how that thing is called in English. So something just fell down.
It was an example of anxiety, right? Because it's boom, like that's an example of nothing being known thingness, where the outside environment actually is alive and stuff can happen. So it was a perfect example.
It was quite synchronistic, right? What's going on? And I've lost my thought with that, so I will give it over to you.
Oh no. Well, the anxiety. Well, there's a way in which one of the things we always have to interpret what our emotions mean. And one of the things that can occur is if you don't have, say, a developmental, conditional kind of structure of philosophy, is that you can say, I feel anxiety, therefore I'm doing it wrong. This is not the way, right? When really anxiety could be the challenge that you have to face and go through in order to therefore experience the wonder, right? Like we always have to choose what our emotions mean. And this is actually why, say in philosophy, it's really important to consider like emotions and not just have an objective thinking where it's non-emotional, right? And then we also have to decide what emotions are good and what are bad, right? Because you kind of have anxiety, right? Anxiety can mean a few things. It can be a kind of like breakdown, can't function, but the risk of anxiety becomes necessary to face if you're going to have the wonder of life come through if you shatter everydayness in the Heidegger sense, right? So anxiety is a price that has to be paid to do that. Well, if you carry around the thought in your head that a feeling of anxiety means you shouldn't be doing something, then precisely when you're going through the conditioning that makes possible wonder, you'll back out and think it's rational and think you're doing the smart thing. And that actually goes to show you where there's an act of interpretation that then determines what we think is rational or the right thing to do, right? Based on the interpretation of the emotion. So I think it's really like that becomes part of the learning of this kind of intersuppositional philosophy, where if you're just looking for kind of a grounding, anxiety would be evidence that there isn't a ground here. Okay, we'll move on. You would move on to something else, right? Because you don't see the grounding. Whereas in intersuppositional thinking, anxiety means you're moving into the space where you can experience wonder. It's not something that you necessarily retreat for therefore, because the other thing people will do is just say, I feel anxiety, therefore nihilism is true. Like they'll draw a conclusion on what worldview is true based on that emotional feeling, right? But if you situate it within an artistic framework, like to write, you have to face fears, you have to overcome your anxieties, you have to train. Oh, this emotion is actually a sign of possibly being on the right road, not the wrong road, right? Like another thing we mentioned, the eye of charity, if you have this idea that, oh, I was saying with the eye of charity, to experience, you have to like risk the fear or face the fear of being deluded or rationalizing or trying to see good where there's not good, right? You have to face those things. Well, if you've been trained to kind of think that worry about illusion as evidence that you're in the wrong direction, as opposed to a necessary fear you have to face to make possible the eye of charity, then you will interpret the risk of illusion as evidence you shouldn't be doing it. As opposed to if you have a conditional framework, the risk of delusion is precisely the almost satanic temptation in the wilderness not to engage in the eye of charity, as is needed to deal with, say, the problem of evil in the Zosima sort of sense, right? So the choice of how to, so I guess what I'm saying is the way you interpret these emotions or risks radically shifts when you move from searching for ground to intersuppositional. And that's a big deal, because until you make that move, it's natural to continue to interpret these emotions in a way that would not have us push into them and be conditioned by them, but to instead retreat from them and then convince ourselves we're doing the rational or wise thing. So this switch of framework leads to a change in an interpretation of what all these things mean. What these emotions mean, how, and then that would also mean you have to get good at emotional intelligence, right? To tell the difference, say, between anxiety, worry, fear, care, concern. Like, what are the difference between all these things? Well, an ability to kind of have a sense of those differences becomes a big deal, because then you're going to be better to tell which emotions is a sign you're on the right path, or as opposed to which emotions are a sign you're creating drama with people, right? And then likewise, the piece learning to speak. Like, you've got to learn how to speak and how to talk to people, because that's going to affect the conditioning that you do with people that will transform the intersuppositional condition in which being discloses itself. So there's an entirely different way that one thinks about all these different skills. Whereas if you're looking for a ground that's non-conditional, the way you speak doesn't matter. What you feel doesn't matter, because the ground is not conditional upon these feelings, right? It's not conditional upon what you say. Well, unfortunately, that just leads to poor interpretations of these things that can get in the way of, say, cultivating skills or the ability to have being disclosed in certain ways. So again, I think there's an entirely different hermeneutical framework that develops when you move into intersuppositional thinking.
Yeah, I mean, Nishitani makes this point that with the advent of nihilism, which started, I would say it started with people like Pascal, and when he told, the universe is open. And Nietzsche also talks about that with the death of God, now the horizon has opened. And Nietzsche, in the death of God, you kind of feel the terror and the anxiety. In this other aphorism that I have in mind, he talks more about it like it's more like an adventure. We have to embrace that now, so to say, the sea is open, and we can set sail again. Schopenhauer, for example, talks about the horror vacui, these immense depths of the universe where there's just darkness. It's terrifying, right? Now Nishitani makes this point that only with nihilism, what also becomes a question is the self. And that's because the self as a kind of the self itself became a question mark, because before we can say, yeah, we are children of God or something. But with nihilism, then also these philosophies like existentialism or psychoanalysis, really taking up the task of inquiring what is actually the self, what is the human being, that now really becomes an issue again. And that's maybe a good thing about nihilism. Suddenly there's, so to say, the self in its depth dimensions. Think about depth psychology as well. Suddenly that also opened and becomes an issue. So just to say that that's not just a bad thing, but it actually it made possible some of these other emergent philosophies. But I just want to give support to what you said with this change that slowly happened over the time of, let's say, modernity, we're still in it, right? It's a gradual process of this whole transformation from, let's say, a metaphysical scheme where we had a ground, we are assured of that ground, towards this other scheme, kind of with nihilism as a kind of transitory phase. And we don't know yet where we will end. Maybe we'll also devour ourselves in perspectivism and ideology. And you mentioned in this talk that you mentioned Duginism, so to speak. This, this when we don't find the way out towards let's say towards a philosophy that takes this all seriously. But yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, if there's there's a few things. So if you could actually find a ground, a risk of that is it might actually create egotism, because you can create a transcendent ground for yourself. I have a transcendent ground. So there's actually a positive side of the impossibility of finding that, where if the only transcendent support, if you will, is a no-thingness that emerges in relation, then I can't be an egotist because I need you in order to make the no-thingness appear, really. And I was wondering too, there's almost a way in which one of the reasons why you need like the dialogos practices is to actually, one, wait a minute, there is no thingness between people. Like no thingness is a category because you feel that in the gaze. I think Sartre and all these people were trying to get at that. They just took it in a non-Eastern direction, is that you feel that nothing is not nothing, that it's a term I've used is lack, a present absence, or a no thing with the N-O hyphen thing. And if you can learn that between people, then the next level is the ability to feel that and see that when you're alone. It's almost like there's you have to do the training there, because it's really hard to like feel no thingness versus nothing by yourself. But it's like almost like with people and like participatory experiences like that, you can learn the difference. And then from that training, carry it with you when you're not with yourself. So then it's like you carry with you the relationship and you start defining yourself according to the traces of the relationship and different things like that. So it just kind of entered my head, and it makes me think like, the role of there really couldn't be no thingness without a self. It's almost like the role of the self is to make possible the distinction between nothing and no thingness, because a self can experience that difference and choose to see that difference by relating to other selves, right? Whereas it's almost like a long time we've thought of the self as like identity, like who am I, as opposed to thinking of the self as a kind of ontological condition that makes possible relation, which is where you find the intersuppositional grounding. So it's like the self then becomes much less in the business of, say, defining itself as an identity. And instead, the self is way more about entering into conditions where nothing is no thingness, which then unveils the self as a no thing too. Right? Like you can have a sort of understanding. It's like, oh, I can't define the self because it's a no thing. Any definition you give it is going to be limiting what it is. It's always something more. And the reason it's always something more is because its fullness comes out in relations of which cannot be reduced to it. And so the movement for the presuppositional to the intersuppositional, I do think it kind of makes relations ontological, right? And I think that's kind of Whitehead. I've been going down a rabbit hole trying to get Bergson and Deleuze because I'm an idiot. Don't do that, anyone. If you're listening, don't do that. Anyway, it's kind of fascinating, but it's also one of those things where it's like, I just don't understand virtual. What does virtual mean? It's real, but it's not actual. Anyway, but there's so relations are kind of ontological. And there is really, like, I've talked with Trey about it in like the notion of communal ontology, which is like the Trinity, where you got three persons, one essence. And there is something about these practices that are unveiling the self is more like a person of a shared essence that comes out in relation, as opposed to the self being its own essence, where it's something like that seems to be coming out.
That's I think Nishitani would agree with that. Because he has this, right? He has this topological structure that he describes in Religion or Nothingness. And the self kind of starts out with this almost Cartesian, I'm me and I'm here, and here's the outside world, and so on.
Right.
But it in the great doubt, which also it's more besieging the self. It's not, the self doesn't choose that. It's just sometimes you just wonder what's going on because, I don't know, you become aware of death. Somebody dies around you also. And then it's the self is kind of like, it's a kind of purgatory movement. First through doubt and through these steps of nihility and despair often, and then out again towards this relationality, really. So, and in religion and nothingness, the word they use is actually connected to the Trinity. The perichoresis is the Greek term. The theologian who translated it had that in mind. Because in the Trinity you have three persons, and he thought it's the deepest way of interpretation that kind of like the Western tradition has produced. So it's three in one, one in three.
Right.
Everyone is so the Father is the Father, but also the two others, and so on. Where do I want to go with this one?
Well, and I will just add, I mean, as just a comment on the Trinity, like for a long time, like 1 = 3 is a contradiction. Well, it's a contradiction if identity is grounded. But if identity is intersuppositional, it's not a contradiction, it's a process. It's kind of, you can even use the language of maybe process an event of a whitehead, or where you have relations. And I've heard the Plato footnotes, the Plato guy, who's really great, I really like him, talk about how things are like raindrops on a spider web that come out, and it's like an event, but it's constituted by the relations. Well, likewise, if you think of the Trinity that way, yeah, it seems like a contradiction to say 1 is 3, but if in 1 is the constitution of 3, and if in 3 is the constitution of 1, well, then it's not a contradiction. It's a manifestation of the same ultimate reality, which is intersuppositional as opposed to grounded. So that, when you think of it that way, and then what's interesting is it seems like that description is what comes out in dialogue. I mean, we are seeing evidence. Let's put it that it's almost like empirical, frankly. You're literally seeing evidence that the structure of the self is more like that. It's more Trinitarian than Descartesian. And maybe it's only possible today because of the Zoom technology, because of the ability for people who have the certain attunement to engage to make possible that intersuppositional, that likeness to the Trinity to come out. But there's it's like you're observing the very way that people carry themselves differently, and what occurs, the wonder, the attunement, etc., when you meet that condition versus when you do not. And I think, so I think it's just a fascinating time because it's bringing out that kind of different structure of the subject or the person or so on.
Yeah. The thing is still, right, we are still left with how to let the groundless elements sway, in a sense, in our midst. Heidegger's answer for this was, in a sense, that the element where it can sway is precisely human Dasein.
Yeah, right.
So being there, because we are owned by being, right? So we are we're this strange creature between heaven and earth.
Sure.
We are tasked with, in this book that I discussed with Guy, David Bentley Hart mentions, is similar to Heidegger in that respect. An idea from Maximus, the confessor, that we are the priesthood of creation, because we are in this liminal boundary between heaven and earth, the spiritual and the material, and only the human being is that. And it sounded to me very much like with the later Heidegger, the fourfold. Anyways. Now, how do we do that? Is by, and that is really important, right? We have to find a kind of a completely new way of holding ourselves to this element.
Mm.
We have to constantly enact it, so to say. We have to enact the letting be of nothingness. So this is again the thing with Eckhart and releasement. This is something that needs to be constantly enacted by the human being, and we do it by learning to let go, and then things can unfold in there, such as they are. And from what I learned, I'm not sure, but Hegel's way of thinking is also like letting go in sense, so the thought can unfold itself. And it's similar a little bit with Nagarjuna, because he also would say, don't. He had this famous dichotomy between eternalism and nihilism, let's say being and non-being, perhaps. And he just realized that whenever you don't have to cling to any of those things. You don't even have to cling to shunyata. It's not, because it's not a substance. And I think dialogos, at least the way John and Chris are doing it, is kind of like similar. They would say, let's think about hope. And we go through the propositions, and then we realize we have to let go again.
Yes.
And continue thinking. And
that
just continues and goes on and on. And Plato in the Theaetetus, I don't know if you know what the ending of the Theaetetus is, but then they go through this entire dialogue asking what is knowledge, and then at the end they just realize they have no idea and walk away, basically. It's wonderful. It just exemplifies the exercise of philosophizing. We don't want to get to answers, but we are again constantly participating in this self-realization of reality or thinking.
I think so, you know, I want to first letting go. So I had to write something down really quick because you made me think of something. And I don't have my sticky notes as usual. I ran out, and they're so pricey now. I went to Sam's to pick up my sticky notes. I was like, oh my gosh, they've gone up 100%. Anyway, there's a few things. One, I think you're exactly right that there's something about letting. You know, I like to talk a lot about the difference between vision and plans. And it's more like very often people like deal with the future by planning for the future, when really it's actually better to cultivate your ability to have vision and to see what presents itself, what unfolds. Yes, you have to make a plan to go to the grocery store at 5 o'clock or something, but plans should be more immediate and about getting problems, like they're restricted to like solving like very immediate everyday problems. Like, for example, you run out of water. Well, you got to go to the store and buy it, right? That's just a plan, but you're not really keeping being from disclosing itself, because being has disclosed itself in a manner where you do not have water and you need water, right? So there does have to be times where you use a kind of planned way of thinking so that you survive. But here's the thing. That should be the exception, and the default should be vision, whereas we get trained to do the exact opposite, like, or just to always plan everything. You know, everything is planned and everything is kind of mapped out or whatever. Our entire lives are and everything we're going to do, and that's viewed as responsible. But what that actually does is keep being from disclose itself. And in fact, you just turn everything into material for your plans, right? But this is very interesting because you see, basically what we're suggesting, what is suggested is that a lot of like values like responsibility have to be rethought, right? And people tend to practice according to values. So if literally being discloses itself according to relation intersuppositional, then it is responsible to honor that and irresponsible not to honor that. But if being doesn't so disclose itself because it's, say, grounded, or it doesn't have any potential to do something emergent, then it would be responsible to plan it or control it or to turn it into standing reserves, right? So a point, it's the opening paper of The Conflict of Mind, is that truth organizes values. Whatever you think is true then organizes your moral values, or what you think you ought to do. How you define is determines how you think about ought. I could have more to say on that. So basically also understanding the way that being discloses itself, interests up. That's going to completely have radical ways that you think of the right way to carry yourself in your life and what to do. What's interesting, I think this letting be language is exactly right. The key to it is the double move of you have to commit to something that you then let be. Whereas it seems like it's natural for us to commit to something and control it. Because if you don't commit to being, then you don't allow it to disclose itself because you move on to the next, right? So there has to be this kind of, so the crazy thing now is it's commitment plus let be. Right? It's like, and I think a marriage is a good example, right? Like if you, what do you commit to someone who then you let unfold in their personhood as opposed to try to control them and make you like them, right? But then in the marriage, you also know you influence who they become and they influence you and you try to do what's going to bring out the best in them and they bring out to you. But it's this commitment to letting be. When in our head, like we basically don't commit to things unless we control them. And it's natural, right? Because if you commit to something you don't control, what might happen? See, courage, right? Like you're committed to something that changes into something unexpected. Oh my gosh, well, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to control it. I'm going to plan it. I'm going to make it into standing reserve, right? So this mode of thinking we're describing, I think, and it's very counter to the modern world because we really don't live in a commitment culture. We live in an experience culture. This is the irony. So we're obsessed with experiences, right? And the funny thing with that is that sounds like, oh, you're in the business of being disclosing itself because you want new experiences. Funny enough, when you're obsessed with experience, being doesn't disclose itself because you're always moving to the next thing. So nothing can disclose itself. All you do is just move between beings per se, right? And so in order for being to disclose itself, there has to be a commitment to something, which of course could be a risk because it might be a bad commitment or stuff might not work out, but then you let it be and unfold accordingly. That and likewise, you commit yourself to the dialogos, right? You commit yourself to the conversation. You commit yourself to the emergence. You have to commit to making the conditions arise where emergence occurs, and then let the emergence occur, even if it's scary, even if it's unexpected. But then that's why doing the work to be able to handle the emergence or to respond to the emergence, like in a cipher, is huge because then you're ready for it. And you can be better for it and you become for it. Well, all of this is so right there, this is thinking that commits to let be as opposed to thinking that commits to control. And that is to define. And now it's funny you bring this all up and I'll give it back to you because this actually has been why I've been so desperately trying to understand Deleuze, anti-representationalism. He seems to be very similar to Bergson's intuition, which is a confusing concept, but I'm kind of getting it and trying to and to see the difference between that and Hegel and the science of logic. And it's almost like in Deleuze, you have an essential difference that you intuit, but you never represent. You have a sense of the whole, but you never break it into parts, and you let it be that whole as it unfolds holographically. That's a mouthful, I understand. I'm not even sure if I know what that means. I'm trying. Whereas in Hegel, it's like you think categories precisely to the point they fail. Like you let things be by thinking the representation to the point where the representation no longer holds, destabilizes, and then dialectically becomes other. Both of these, this is kind of like, I guess, a nerdy philosophical debate now, because I'm not sure. Both of these seem to be in the business of trying to let things be. But it seems like they're different in method. That's why I've been thinking a lot about and trying to get a hold on those differences, because it seems like relations are virtual in Deleuze, which then might weaken them from being able to uphold essential difference. Whereas in Hegel, it seems to me that relations are very actual, that things are their relations. I'm not sure, though, because I'm not even really sure what the function of the word virtual is in Bergson. I'd really like to, and I'm really feeling like Deleuze is extraordinarily Bergsonian, but I'm not sure. So that's the geeky debate I've been having on the difference between letting be. But anyway, the main point is we have to think of letting be in the context of commitment, because without commitment, things can't let be. There can only be experience.
So Byung-Chul Han, he has written this great book, which was translated, published in English like 6 months ago or so. Nonthings, I think was the title. And he makes this point that in order to have a relation to the thing world, we as human beings came up with many rituals, practices, virtues, which are all very, very time intensive. Only by time intensive rituals, marriage being one, but it can be, when you have shoes and you're cleaning them every day, that's a ritual that allows you, that lets be the shoe. So because it helps you, and then you also have a thing world that's, so to say, animated or spirited. Again, because this is kind of like the argument in Nonthings. It's like, with this consumer culture that we have erected in the 20th century, like all the things, and Rilke talks about this, for example, and so a poet in 1919 or so, he talked that there's like, it's all these counterfeits. What we things have become counterfeits in our time. So that's the first thing that's really important, right, to stress this again with the time-intensive practices. And I think it's a catastrophe what's going on in relationships today. I have, when you talked about with letting be, I thought about, like, I read this when the pandemic started, a lot of people bought a puppy. Puppy is a good example. You can't control it. It's not like, you can't control it. But so you have to learn to let it be, and then but what I read is that in many Western countries, then when people realize that this is really hard to take care of a puppy, they gave them back, which is very hard for a puppy. It's like the worst thing. They feel like they have been abandoned by the world. So I read this, like the numbers were really staggering. So I think with Heidegger, we can learn a lot about that, because he made up this dichotomy of letting be. And then what would come is the fourfold, and the thing in its thinging and all of that, versus this, where we just control everything and nature becomes a standing reserve. I would just once again, D.C. Schindler, he is this theologian that Todd John Levesque had on the channel before. He made a point in a conversation, also a little bit with Heidegger. He talked about, and this is again this idea that we are the priesthood of creation. We are participating so we are participating in the realization of the ontological finality of things. And he made this example with wine, which I thought was excellent, because when you have just wine grapes, it's only the human labor, the human work, that kind of like finalizes them into their perfected state of wine, where then earth and heaven come together. For me, this is because I'm a tea drinker and I drink a lot of Japanese tea. I had to think about that, because it's kind of the same example. This product, this end product of having like tea or wine, only the priesthood of creation, the human being, can do that. And so it is with all other artistic practices. It's kind of like the point of all of that. Things can only sway, so to say, in human Dasein. We are the only beings that are capable of beholding them, giving them a world, artistically expressing them, and letting them be in art and so on. And so they can shine forth in their truth. And that's realizing that puts a lot of responsibility actually on the human being, because it tells us we don't have to be nihilistic, but this dimension into which we are born into is also the dimension where things can turn, so to say. They can turn from worldlessness and the forsakenness by being into the fullness of being. And I would say religion with the eye of charity can do that in the interpersonal realm, and art can do it in the realm of, let's say, beings and things. So.
Magnificent. You know, there's a few things. If one thinks of the point of life as, say, to be happy, right? In a sense, that's kind of looking for a ground, right? Happiness is your ground, right? I feel good. Well, then you end up experiences. You think about what can I use to feel happy, so on and so on and so on. But if you think instead that the meaning of life is to contribute to helping things be and unfold a certain way and to honor them, well, then you have a kind of shepherd role, right? Heidegger's shepherd of being, there's a kind of, honoring role, right? So one of the big things that actually can help deal with the problem of meaning is because happiness is actually quite vapid. It's kind of random. One of the reasons it's hard to find meaning, if you make the meaning of life happiness, is because it's outside of your control. It feels arbitrary, egotistical, empty, and it can be it tends to become pathological, right? I always like where Mrs. Zaki in the documentary is like, no, the meaning of life isn't happiness. That's not it. That's not it. That's not it. And I'm like, well, Mrs. Zaki said so. I don't mess with Studio Ghibli. But like, if the meaning of life is to help things unfold as themselves and to be themselves and to shepherd being in that sense, that gives you a different role. And there, your happiness comes from the witnessing of things unfold, as opposed to your consumption of experiences. That's an entirely different source. Your way of finding happiness or joy, I would argue it's more like joy, is deeper, is based on experience of life. Well, life has meaning then, like right there. Like if life unfolding a certain way creates wonder, well, you just apprehended meaning, right? So that goes a long way. So like, instead of thinking in terms of, oh, the point of life is to feel good, or even to like make my plan be realized. I have a 30-year plan and the meaning of my life is to meet that plan. Well, that may work for you, but there's a risk in that because it's what? Controlling. You're trying to force life to unfold a certain way. And that's why having vision can be more important. But if instead of thinking like the point of life is happiness, and maybe think instead that the point of life is inspiring, helping people have vision, helping people experience dialogos and emergence, helping people experience conditioning, then the way you think is to think in, how do I do that? How do I help things let be? How do I do that, as opposed to how do I find happiness or something like that? I think C.S. Lewis, one of his best ideas is the first things first principle, where he says that if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. I think that's very true. I think that's exactly true to life. If you make happiness your goal, you don't get happiness. But if instead you make your goal helping things let be, or cultivating vision, or inspiration, or helping be a condition of the possible, making your life be a condition that contributes to beauty, truth, and goodness and hope, well, then you can find happiness. And I think you see that in the saints, right? Like we take the Christian saints, they're not in it for happiness, and they end up being very joyful. In fact, they're like poor and tortured and miserable, and yet they seem to have something that other people don't have. Well, I think a part of that is precisely when happiness is not your goal, but instead the language they would use would be like providence, call, will of God, where there's something all about that is a kind of unfolding of being, right? A kind of disclosure of what God intends, or letting things come forth. The key also move to this, I think, that has gotten us in trouble, that contributes to us not thinking this way that I'm describing in terms of letting be, is we don't really view, like when people would like eat animals, they would often like in rituals, like have like a ritual to honor the animal they killed, right? There was a sense of a loss, right? Maybe it was necessary, but it was a sense of a loss. Or say people would pray before meals and they'd be like, hey, this food is here because give us this daily bread. The craftsman, the baker, they made the bread, and there's this entire sacrifice. We don't really view technology as sacrificing letting be. Like, when we create or we plan, there's a sacrifice. Maybe it's a good sacrifice, maybe it's a necessary sacrifice, but we don't view it as a kind of loss of a potential of letting be, nor do we think about it. Because if you did that, then you would say, well, we better use this technology to help things let be because we've inhibited some let being for this. And what's our goal? So this, I guess there's an entirely different, I guess what I'm getting at is there's an entirely different way that you would approach technology and quote unquote progress or whatever, right? Because right now, if the point is to be happy, to feel good, or to be productive or whatever, then technology is kind of the accomplishment of life, not letting be, right? But if instead you flip it and you said that the point is to let be, well, then there's always something tragic in technology that then would help you use it right. Like if you thought of technology as an inhibiting letting it be, then when you use technology, you'd say, okay, there's a kind of I have sacrificed some being, some letting be for this technology. So I sure as heck better make sure that this technology enables letting be in different areas, or that I don't overfit it, or that I use it in a manner that contributes to letting be versus not. So that just completely transforms your framework of thinking about how to use these different technologies. They stop, because you see them kind of tragically. You see them in a tragic way, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but it's like if you kill the animal, you better eat it. You better honor it, right? Okay, you killed some being with technology. Well, you better use it well. You better honor it. You better use it. It like transforms your mode. Whereas we don't even think in terms of letting be. We don't think of loss with technology. In fact, the technology is the crown jewel of being. History has come to this technology. This is what being discloses as. The Zoom call, the computer. This is the disclosure of being. So then we think that this is like the disclosure of being. This is history arising at its highest point, as opposed to having a tragic view of it. Where you say, yes, we have these technologies that enable good things. Heidegger is not anti-technology. Heidegger wants to give you a tragic sense of the tendency of technology to capture thinking, to make us think as technology as the proper disclosure of history, as opposed to a threat to that then we have to make sure we use it in honor of the letting be. And it's just the more advanced the technology gets, the more difficult it is to do that. Precisely because it seems so vivid, it seems so powerful, it seems so amazing. So resisting that technology gets harder. And that's where I do like, as Cadello and I have talked about progress in Hegel, there is progress in Hegel, it just gets harder. It just becomes more difficult. Like as you go through progress, in order to progress, it becomes more unlikely you meet that progress, precisely because it becomes so difficult to not fall into the negative temptations that are made possible by that progress. So yeah, things get better, but they also, as they get better, there's a decrease in the probability that they will continue to get better, precisely because the temptations of it become harder. And I like that framework of progress, because that seems right, because it has a consistency of human nature. Yes, there is progress technologically, but it becomes more difficult not to fall into the temptations of that. So I think those recalibrations in thought can go a long way.
I think do you know there's the in English, this was published as Discourse of Thinking from Heidegger. There's a memorial address in there. It's one of the more lucid texts from Heidegger, where he addresses the public. And I find the text remarkably easy to understand. Discourse of Thinking is the book. And there's the memorial address is precisely on releasement. And there Heidegger cultivates this dictum of the simultaneous yes and no to technology. And he has some other things. So releasement, he calls it releasement to things and openness to the mystery. These are like the two things that he lays out. So in a sense that, because I think he sensed this kind of like capturing element that also Deleuze talks about, this capturing element of technology. How we are bewitched by, I mean, Heidegger talks about, magazines and the TV and, the voice of the radio and these things. These people can be happy that they haven't witnessed the 21st century. And so the simultaneous yes and no, this kind of like using them, yes, and acknowledging that, like not trying to uninvent them or trying to get away with them or get rid of them or something like that, but really realizing when you're captured by them. Now, I read an essay from somebody else, and there was Now, how can we really, as philosophers, what can we do with science? And the answer that was given there was also letting it be, but holding yourself at the same time. You let science, because nobody of us can stop this also. Because often that's the temptation, kind of like that we think, oh, we have to go back where all things, right, to this kind of like where the cycle of life, where we're in this perennial bliss, and that, but that doesn't work. So what we can do is we let science be, and letting it be, letting it move towards its end, its final end, whenever perhaps not in our lifetime, but we let it be, and we hold open with art. That's why Heidegger makes this comparison, science and art. With art, we can learn to hold ourselves in this different topos, this different space, where we can kind of like, Heidegger would say something like, we wait, we have patience, we wait when being comes back again in its fullness. I think that would really be my genuine answer to that problem. So again, it's a letting be answer. We let science be. We don't say it's bad, it's demonic or something, because that's again the Duginism trap. I think that's also not. I mean, we often have to, right? I'm also tempted to often, you know, fall into that kind of thinking. But I mean, technology and science have given us many things that I think none of us want to abandon, you know. But we have to be careful and yeah, let it be.
Oh no, I mean, well, the temptation of experiencing groundlessness is to just say, well, they're all wrong, and just go back to like traditional philosophy or something and be like, yep, that's all. And that can actually be a temptation of religion today, whether it be Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or different thing. A temptation of that can be to go, oh, well, we believe in God, therefore we have a ground, so we don't need to worry about any of the intersuppositional, the becoming other of Hegel, the intuition, you know, we don't have to worry about that because we're good to go. Well, that's an option, yes. But you see, there is, I think, very important material. Like I would argue in Christianity, God has always been a Trinity, that it has always been based on relation, that it has always been based on community. And actually, Christianity has been, frankly, at its worst when it's been about having kind of a grounding for your life that gives you meaning. And then you just go to church and you have that, but you're not necessarily engaging in the relations, right? I think that applies to all the religions, frankly. And we don't see like Jesus. When Jesus is like teaching the New Testament, he's not like, believe these things and then you'll have meaning and you'll be good to go. He's like, do this. So he's like, this is a very different mindset. But then unfortunately, as I was speaking with Dimitri, you know, what became central, especially say in American Protestantism, is the doctrine of atonement. Jesus died for your sins. If you believe that, you're saved, and you go from there. And in no way whatsoever do I want to suggest that there's no possible truth or any way whatsoever to any of that. However, if that becomes a source of a ground, as opposed to a kind of like, oh, Jesus did this for me, so I don't need to try to save the world. I just need to worry about my neighbor. Like it gives you confidence to do what Jesus told you to do. That's one thing. But when it replaces what Jesus told you to do, then you have a problem. Then it's Cartesian. And I think people like N.T. Wright or even Moltmann or different people are quite good on that. And I think you can actually go through basically all the religions and do similar things. And I know that I actually think that work is a big deal, because I think if we're trying to deal with nihilism today, one of the great tasks is a reformation of these pre-existing religions with material they have within them. Not just saying they're wrong or bringing in some ideas you wish were true. No, going through the exegesis work to find that Christianity makes far more sense in terms of, I guess, N.T. Wright would say First Temple Judaism versus Second Temple Judaism, that it makes more sense in terms of an incarnational theology versus a Descartesian Cartesian theology, right? Well, that's important work. And anyone who's doing that in Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, that matters. And I think I think that's really worth doing, because yes, I know there are some, like Brendan has that book on emergentism and a new religion of emergentism. I think it's going to, that helps some people, and that's good. But you have millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of people that are already ascribed to these major religions, right? And carrying out a reformation within them in terms of their ontology, I think is really quite important, is something I think about. So.
I mean, one other point, and I'll just say this because it came up in this conversation you had on the channel, on your channel before. I think if we take this seriously, an ontology of relationality and groundlessness, what will come at some point, we won't strive for these. I think we won't continue striving for these massive, like, replacement grounds, these kind of, like, these super centralized political structures, which in a sense ground all the other structures.
That's right.
But what we will have is a network of many small, decentralized communal entities. And they are good. There's actually good evidence that this is also, from an empirical point of view, it's better. I don't know if this was like a year ago, so we or 1.5 years ago, we watched these videos from this guy called Richard Werner. He's an economist and bank like researches in banks and monetary system, and he thinks that if you have a system of decentralized banks, so not one central bank that prints money, but many like a huge network of decentralized banks that all can print money by themselves, that would stabilize the system. And then he would suggest that could solve this problem that capitalism has with this, like, you always have a boom and then you have a bust. But that could sound like we can have sustainable growth by that, because otherwise we just, what we see now, basically, you at one point you just have to print money and then it collapses, and then all of that. So I think that would make a lot of sense also, like, let's say, economically, in terms of community building, if it takes this idea of an ontology of relationality seriously. So
the question of decentralization, we mentioned the book E.F. Schleiermacher, I think, Small is Beautiful, Leopard Coe's Breakdown of Nations, that's very good. And the other thing is, like, Nassim Taleb with that other professor, they have, like,
exactly that. I thought about that as well. So the more decentralized a system is, that may come with insecurity and anxiety for, like, the individual entities, but it strengthens the system, and that's kind of like the bonus of capitalism.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's an argument to be made that biological systems do not allow anything to become too big, because that threatens the entire system. Like, there's, like, a point where things naturally fail. And you could argue that what has happened in banking is that it allows institutions to get to they don't fail before they're too big. And that then makes them systemic. And once they're systemic, well, it's an entirely different system, right? Because it's now systemic. There's arguments to be made that if the Federal Reserve was indeed a bank of last resort, just like Bretton Woods argued that it would be, and different things like that it could pump liquidity into the system in emergency situations and could do good. The issue is, it's just very, very difficult for human beings to use something like that as a weapon of last resort. It just becomes way too easy to use it to create speculative growth. And then, frankly, arguably, and this is really cynical, I'm afraid there might actually be incentives, say, for the dollar to be too big to fail, because if it is, people still have to buy the bond. Like, why is the dollar the strongest it's ever been? There's literally a shortage on dollars when it's inflated into oblivion. That makes no sense. Well, because other nations, if they don't invest in the dollar or buy the dollar and it fails, the global ramifications of it could be dire. So it's frankly a giant global debt bubble. It's like, it's almost like a hostage situation. And that's really the problem whenever you're dealing with more simulacral phenomenon, simulation-like phenomenons like dollars, is whereas nature naturally keeps systems from being too big. Like if an elephant is born that is so big, like too big, its bone structure won't hold it up, its organs will fail, and it will die, so the gene won't pass on. So like nature has a tendency to find a fitting size that will work with the ecosystem, and it's relative to the ecosystem, right? Well, simulated phenomenons or simulacra, I'm trying to use that Baudrillard term, simulacra, I guess, things like money. Money is not forced by an ecosystem to not become too big or too debt driven, right? Humans have to maintain the ecosystem by their own programming, right? Well, that means there's no necessary this is the thing. Nature will necessarily, by its own nature, create decentralization. Humans and anything they create are not forced to do that. They can choose not to do it. And then the strategy is to make it so centralized that no one can afford for the centralization to fail. And definitely, I think if we understand a lot of Dugin's critiques of the West, he's like, that's what's going on, and we got to make sure we're not part of the West, or we're going to be stuck. We're going to be stuck in this too big to fail system. And by the way, that too big to fail system creates the meaning crisis and the psychology crisis and the death of spirit, which is kind of where I think he's bringing that out of people like Bourdieu for different things. Anyway, yeah. So what really the trick is you have decentralization that's kind of a form of. So there seems to be like a succession that's like the American Confederacy, right? Where you say we're going to succeed and states' rights and so on and so forth. Now, the topic of the Civil War is a fascinating topic. I'm tempted to get into Shelby Foote and the debates between all those different people. But the point is there's a kind of segregationist, decentralization, of which can have some different troubles. You also have in America the Articles of Confederacy that were problematic because they were very decentralized, but they were actually so decentralized that it was dysfunctional, right? So the trick is a form of decentralization that still has relation. That seems to be the great trick. You could argue that was the hope of the Federalist program. Like the Constitution in America was supposed to be a balance between centralization and state. Of course, the problem is some states use that to do immoral things, right? So then you get rid of it, right? Well, that always seems to be the problem, the human element, right? We create a kind of a system that balances decentralization and centralization, but maintaining that balance, that very delicate balance, almost seems like it. This is what I wonder. Can that be systemized, or must it always be a human element? Because if it's always up to the humans to cultivate that relation, well, then these practices are a big deal. Like all the practices and everything we're talking about becomes completely massive because it's required by humans and the human element to do this work.
It's actually, I read a lecture course by Dugin on political philosophy, but he makes a good point there, I think, with Plato. Because why do the guardians of the polis have to be trained philosophers, being capable of beholding the ideas? Because right, only when you have cultivated a vision that is capable of beholding the ideas, then you can guard the polis and be a politician in this sense. Right. So that's why I think human practices are so important. And only, I mean, this is this whole Heidegger thing, only when we as human beings can be in a relation, not just, let's say, with other, but in a relation to principle, to being itself, capital B being. Only then we can solve all of this.
Oh no, it seems to and I know it's probably 1 a.m. now, so you're a good soul. This debate between well, this is where I'm kind of interested, like Hegel. So as Hegel's becoming other, the AB logic I always talk about, that centers in a kind of, that creates a decentralized possibility, but a decentralization that's kind of Trinitarian, because that's the best metaphor. Like in a sense, God is decentralized, but they share an essence. This is what's kind of unique on that model, right? It's like they're different persons, and yet they are somehow also unified, right? So as weird as it may sound, what does a political economy look like that's kind of Trinitarian? What then, this would be the question, what creates the essence? We know we have different persons because, man, you know, you're not me. We have different consciousness, right? So what creates the essence? Is the essence only possible because of human individuals conditioning themselves in the manner where they can create that essence by kind of sharing it, the attunement? Can the essence only be a result of attunement? Or is there somehow to create literally systems that carry out that attunement, like on an institutional level? That's very curious. Like, there's a sense in which it seems like Web 3.0 is trying something like that. It would seem as if the legal system in America, or let me put it this way, the Constitution was trying to do that, and the institution was law, because it's almost like in order to have attunement institutionalized, it has to be kind of like in the between space between physical and it's like metaphysical. Law is kind of metaphysical, right? So this like, can the essence be systemized, or can it only be a shared human attunement? That's a curious question to me.
That's a good one, right? Because in the logos, I mean, when you come to, let's say you come to the practice, you may feel you're separate. I'm me, you are you, and so on. But then when you really do this practice well, then there's this dynamic going on, which kind of like, and the boundaries dissolve, and then, you know, we've reported this many times, right? Then something like Geist or Logos, we participate in that, and it's almost that's now mediating the outcome.
Yes,
there's this creative emergence, which is not governed by me, neither by me nor by you, but by the Logos or the Geist or whatever. Spirit, Geist is spirit. Now, I thought about this. It seems to me that to have an intergenerational transfer, because, you know, when you're like a 5-year-old kid, you can do all of these things. We need, I think in terms of intergenerational transfer, institutions are crucial. Otherwise, it's a trend, it's a thing. And then it goes away, and nobody can remember it after a couple of years. But it needs to be something that can be like handed over in a tradition. I mean, this is why in Catholicism the church too is holy. The church is a body. We are all part of the body of the church, you know. And then with Protestantism, why that was such a blow to organized Christianity, and why they also, right, they just have to create something new, and then often these things dissolve again, and they're kind of like just, you know, they appear and then they disappear. I think we need institutions, yeah.
Oh, there is no doubt that this anti-institutional, even anti-expert, even though I think the experts deserve a lot of criticism, like, you can take that too far, right? In the sense of, like, if you don't have that, it becomes quite difficult to provide housing for your social order, or to have tradition that kind of builds. And tradition is not merely arbitrary. Tradition is a collection of trial and error. Like, it's a system of knowledge acquisition, right? And you need institutions as well. So you can say, oh, I don't know, go get a job, or meet people, or do different things. Like, arguably, one of the whole problems of the people always being on their computers all the time is they're not participating in any institutions or going into community. Like, that's part of the whole, and arguably that's why you have a giant meaning crisis. The problem is that institutions are simulacra like money, and thus can become too big to fail or become oppressive unless humans do the right thing. And unfortunately, it seems very natural or probable for humans to eventually not do the right thing. And so then they go beyond the correct balance of centralization. So it's almost like we have to impose upon ourselves a certain level of failure for the size of institutions so that you can have an effective decentralization with relation.
I would say that's right. That's only when they don't allow like a process of, when they don't allow for a kind of process of negativity.
Yes.
So yes, when you make yourself the monopole on, let's say, credentials, we're the only, but when others do it, that doesn't count. You're not a philosopher when you don't have a PhD in philosophy.
Right.
When you don't allow for that movement, kind of like this self-emptying movement, this movement of negativity, and you make yourself again like a ground for the, let's say, the university is the ground for all other, for knowledge transfer, then that's the problem. And I see it because, we have a system for everything today. We have a health system, we have a school system, we have a university system. They are today also global often, and they are not tolerant of anything, any other attempts of, that like, let's say, institutions that would say healthy competition. They don't like that. This is also a problem, I would say, with science often. Science is not very tolerant of other forms of knowledge, such as religion or art. And then we come again to this problem, you self-absolutize yourself and you can't let anything other than yourself be. You just rest in yourself and your own substance. And then you're not in an ontology of relation or relationality, but you're again in this, this substance mode of thinking. But that would really be, right? Just what Werner, the guy I mentioned before, he just said, create banks. That's his solution to financial crisis. Just create banks, make your own bank. That would be his solution. And so I would say, when you have a problem in the schooling system, make your own school. When you have a problem somewhere else, make your own, and that might. It's also a danger then, but that helps this tendency of this absolutization of the other system.
Well, that's where, again, you have to have a system of testing. And, to determine, to have reason to think that what is presented is best or possibly best or good reason to think is best. And that's going to require people to create alternatives. If there are no alternatives, then how do you know, what you have is best? But if it's able to compete and show that it's best. And this is also why it is important to understand that competition has a knowledge acquisition function. There's a form of competition that's rivalrous and status anxiety and bad, but there's also a form of competition that competition actually stops power. Competition stands up to power. Competition is a way to stop power. If I can always invent a new technology, then I can always possibly bankrupt Apple. There's always the possibility. And also it's really important, and I think this is a good point. Yes, a lot of these giant corporations today are very big and they're very powerful, but none of them has been around even close to like most governments. Most governments have been around, or banks, way longer than Apple or any of these things. And really, you see concentrations of power that are very long lasting, more so where there's not competition, because you really can't compete with the government, right? If you do, they put you in jail. If you compete with the banks, you get in trouble. That's throwing, because they own the monetary system. And so that is where we've seen a lot of dysfunction. And I would argue that a lot of the dysfunction you see in corporations are because they get in bed with the government, right? So a lack of competition. It's often said that competition just means power destroys the weak and they get more powerful. That's true. That can happen. But it's also a way to actually stop power from overly concentrating, because especially in a market where the main thing the market wants is creativity and innovation. If I can literally, if I create a better Zoom call function than Zoom, I can literally destroy Zoom. Any kid on the street who comes up with a new idea has the possibility of doing that. Now, Zoom may buy them out, of course, but then another company who hates Zoom may buy it out, and there's a innovative structure. But this would mean that in order to create the effectiveness of the competition, the name of the game is allowing someone on the street to have a seat at the table, not just college kids who is able to bring that idea. And also, so you don't have a monopoly on credentials like colleges do. And also you have everyone training in the realm of creativity, not to just be employees. It's kind of funny, if everyone's trained to be employees, well, of course the powerful just get bigger because everyone's trained to work for them. But if there's a real emphasis on creativity, innovation, and technology, then that means the system is heavy in creative destruction potential, right? So there's a lot of creative destruction. So it definitely seems that there is a condition of a certain attunement to make competition actually be a way to contribute to decentralization and the generation of an emergence of value through creativity. So there's that work that has to do. So the question becomes, what are the practices? What are the classes? What are the institutes? What are the modes of life that is going to create more creativity than not? And really, if you get trained or really become very well experienced in dialogos experiences, then you come to realize that you do have the potential to emerge to something unknown. Well, then you can be creative. What do most people say? They say, I'm not creative. Oh, I can't paint. I can't create. I don't have any ideas. They're like, that's how they feel, right? Well, if you were ever in a situation where you experience yourself as contributing to something unexpected, you might view yourself as creative. And the moment you view yourself as creative, then you actually have the potential to upset power or to take down too big to fail or to create empowerment. And so that right there decreases the likelihood of cancerous centralization or centralization that's too big. And then the essence that everyone shares as different persons is that shared attunement to creative possibility. And so I do think, like, basically a school system that's in the business of creative generation probably does more oral, quote unquote, exams than memorization exams, because an oral exam is like this, a conversation, you have to show what you mean. Probably it's going to be more so in the business of analyzing the meaning of text, not just the information of text. Probably engaging in conversations that have a kind of dialogo structure, a kind of cipher circling structure. Those seem like they're going to be a big deal. Also, destroying the college monopoly on credentials is probably a big deal. The ability to invest in communities like, circling or indie thinkers or voicecraft, investing, not just donating, which is what I would call the pricing problem of horizons, is going to be a big deal, because I need to be able to put like $1,000 in voicecraft, hold it there. They have liquidity to keep the system going. And then a year later, I find it's turned into 2,000. Now there's zero sumness. You have to introduce as much. Here's the thing. For decentralization to be sustainable, it has to introduce as much zero sumness into the system as possible. Non-zero sumness, I'm sorry. So like they're tied together. And that is going to increase sustainability. And then dialogos communities can increase. And the thing is, if I put $1,000 into a dialogos community and the people that go generate value, then they reinvest in it just like an equity on the stock exchange, then it turns into $2,000. That also sends a signal to the market of ideas that this works. And that creates a spreading function because of the efficiency. It may be, I do think NFTs as a pricing mechanism, not as a speculative insane market, which has been a disaster, but as a pricing mechanism may actually be able to help in the ability to invest in horizons. But that is all what will need to occur. And that's all institutional. That is all on a systems level, of which is a system of which is trying to create a greenhouse to cultivate the growth of that shared attunement, of which then makes a kind of Trinitarian structure with people in a culture, of which then share. Because then what you do is you start going, wait a minute, all of the different cultures, all the different nations, all the different people now have the shared attunement to where they can relate to each other with creative possibility, as opposed to mere monetary exchange. Because that's what's happened, right? And that's what Dugan is trying to resolve. It's like, oh, they just relate to each other in terms of dominance and power, and they have a sort of culture that sneaks in and controls you through economics, right? Well, unfortunately, that's probably true. That tends to occur. But what if the economic relation was actually a condition of creative possibility, right? Where, you know, the Russian creativity, the American creativity, the European creativity that saw relations as ontological and therefore necessary to participate in for beings to be themselves and for being to disclose itself. Well, now you have a creative unfolding. And yes, I understand that there's a whole lot of talk in capitalism about Silicon Valley creativity. It's all concentrated in apps. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where people actually view creative thought as real thought, as most important thought, as opposed to right now, the main thought, and Deleuze is right about this, is representationalism, memorization, knowing truth and false, and what's going to give you the job. As if that's the kind of attunement that people have, then that's not what's going to occur. Economics will not be defined primarily as creativity. And really, you need that creativity to have dialogos. Like that's one of the main features of people who engage in dialogos is creative opening. They're open to it. Because if you're someone who has to know the answer ahead of time through memorization, you're going to impede dialogos because you're going to be interrupting, or you have an idea where the conversation is going to go ahead of time, and it's not going to be emergent at all because you're going to impose your will, your desire upon it, and you're not going to let it be. So the cultivation of that creative attunement through those different avenues we described seems to be institutionally the possibility of a shared attunement of which different persons can have, and then you'd have something more Trinitarian.
I would just say, first of all, that was very good. The other thing I would just say is, you know, bringing back the religious ethics. I think, because I thought about this, I think I agree, you know, in a free market, and we want a free market because it's still the best thing we've come up with. The problem is always, right, that we use, you know, unethical strategies to, let's get rid of opponents, you know.
Yeah.
When an entity in power is threatened in power, it will most likely want to defend itself, and then it will just do. I mean, this is this argument that many make with America as the kind of like the declining great power, and now they just, you know, they do all sorts of crazy things. But the argument would be, right? We can learn this from Max Weber, I think. You know, how did corporations evolve in the first place? Because you had religious ethics behind them. You reinvest into something that exceeds you and is greater in you, and kind of like that enables all of our agencies in some sense, you know, because it's just that, what is a company? It's kind of like enabling all of our agencies in some sense. It's creating livelihood and possibilities. But that is only true because of kind of ethics of self-emptying, where I say, okay, I don't invest in myself, but I give it back, and I give it to the community. That's why also in Italy, for example, right, all these rich people, you know, the Medici or so, they invested in churches and cathedrals and back into the community. And that's also one thing that I really bemoan, you know, when I read about, you know, these plans of, you know, gated communities and all sorts of. That's really then the worst thing. You always have to come back to the community. Whether you're a philosopher or you're a rich person, a rich entrepreneur, you have to come back to the community and give it back, so to speak. And that, I think that could really be an answer to this problem, you know, this game A, game B thing. Because otherwise you just come into kind of like, you know, competition becomes cancerous, and it just, you know, you just, you know, you want to eradicate yourselves. But with that, I think when you really have a religious ethic again, then I think we could solve that problem. I think, and letting be.
Well, the issue is, the question is the terms of the competition. Is it a competition where I'm trying to bankrupt you by, say, figuring out a legal loophole that I'm able to use that you're not, and therefore you lose everything? Or do I compete with you on grounds of, oh, You think you're able to make the best alternative energy? Nope, I think I can. And I have done the personal work and formed a community with my workers so that we can do that. So what are we competing you on ground? We are competing on grounds of creating a better technology. Then if we succeed, what does that do? It spreads to the general public, right? The problem is we have to make a distinction between competition of I want to kill you versus I want to create better than you. And also too, if your main motivation is I want to create better than other people, you're probably not, because you're just looking at the other person. The competition is secondary to the creative act. Like you go, I just want to friggin' solve the alternative energy problem in a manner that makes sense and is economically viable without a ton of unintentional geopolitical consequences. Okay, what is your competition with? The problem. You are competing with the facticity of the world itself that does not have the freaking alternative energy. So your competition is kind of with being, in a sense of, I'm going to figure out how to have this. I'm going to have a competition with being so that it unfolds in a manner that brings forth an alternative energy, because with that alternative renewable energy, it will be easier not to turn the world into standing reserve. So because, if you have to use everything, that can be a standing reserve thing. So your competition is with the condition. And that secondarily has you in competition to get to market first with other people who are doing the same, because there is limited resources. So we have to invest in the alternative resource that is most effective, most cost efficient, and most likely to spread. So the competition is with who can solve that problem the best, and the competition with other businesses is secondary to the competition with the problem itself. That distinction is really important. Also, you need the competition with other people because they're going to think ideas you did not think, right? Like no one knows how to do it. So you have to have lots of people solving the problem together in different ways, so that we might stumble upon, through trial and error, what best works. But the competition with other businesses becomes secondary to the competition with the problem. But the other businesses also create motivation to hurry up and to do it quickly, and to try to treat, say, your employees good so that they come to you and not the other guy, right? So the competition kind of with others is kind of just a necessary secondary condition to the competition with the problem itself. But those are the distinctions that have to be made, because if you just say, oh, we want to get rid of competition in general, well, the problem is human beings, unfortunately, don't seem to be motivated in the same way when they don't have some sort of competitive element that's going on, right? So you just have to make those distinctions, right? Like the fact that why do you do wrestling? Because there's people to compete with. Now, the issue is that after the match, you shake their hand and you're able to talk to them off the mat, right? But the competition creates the condition that makes you want to get better, to do the skills, to learn the techniques. You remove the competition, the imperative goes away. The motivation goes away. So it's learning to compete in a manner to let be, not to compete to control. It's a similar thing. You're competing to let be the development of the skill, to let be the unfurling of being, the creative possibilities, but you need the competition, so the character of the letting be is going to be excellent. I think a lot of this also gets into kind of the question of, how do you make relations like relations ontological without having a form of, say, socialism or communism or different things like that? And there's a fear that when you emphasize relations, you're saying that the community is more important than the individual. That's actually very different from what we're saying, because in the Trinitarian structure, in an emergent structure, you can't make a separation of the parts in the whole. You can't make a separation of the individuals in the community. The mistake of, say, radical capitalism might be to say individuals are real and the community doesn't exist, whereas the mistake of, say, communism could be to say that the collective is real and the individual doesn't exist. That's why the Trinity as a metaphor is so friggin' powerful, because what you have in that is three persons, one essence. You cannot claim that Jesus is reducible to the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Spirit is reducible to the Father, nor can you claim that the different persons of a dialogos are reducible to one another or exchangeable. And also, in a Trinitarian structure, each person of God is what? Trying to be excellent, trying to be excellent. And a concern of like communism is that everyone's mediocre, right? Like everyone's kind of mediocre. The collective will do it and they do it to the state. Dialogos don't work. Emergence doesn't occur if everyone's like mediocre, right? Like, so this structure has an imperative for excellence, right? And yet it's an excellence for the sake of making possible things that can only happen intersuppositionally between people, not excellence for yourself, to be your own ground, but an excellence and I'm making the most of yourself for the sake of then being a condition for the emergence. And it's an entirely different mindset, but it doesn't fall into a kind of ontology of communism that may run the risk. Now, some people would say it doesn't. I mean, it depends on your interpretation. But I think generally speaking, if we're using very general categories, we're not, it avoids the like nominalism, realism debate, basically. You know, nominalism is kind of like universals don't exist. Realism, universals do exist. And you kind of go back and forth. Well, in a Trinitarian structure, it's not really so much a universal, it's an essence that is shared by the persons, which is a slight difference. And you could say that it's a kind of universal, but the difference is, in essence, is an attunement, a shared condition of things, not an abstraction. Right? When you say like these things are all chairs because they share the same essence, you're saying that you can carry out the same action or undergo the same conditioning with these objects, relatively speaking, right? So the collective identification is based on an essence, which is based on a doing, not an abstract category. So when we start saying, like in Trinitarian thought, everyone shares an essence, that is an action, not just an abstract category that you're binding people together. That's all the trouble, right? Like when you bind people with abstract characters, race, nationality, and all that's where you can get so many, like where people become nationalistic or tribal or different things. But if you can bind people with an essence, if we're using the Augustine language of the Trinity, then you're binding them by a shared attunement, a shared action, a shared possibility, not an abstract category. And that's, I think, kind of the key difference.
Yeah, and one thought I had listening to you speak was, I think it's just an intuition I have, that when what we aim for is realness, then I think we can take out a lot of the brutality, the ferocity of competition. Because when we, like, I thought about this, I read this the other day. This seems to be a very prevalent topic, that there seems to be a great imbalance, young people in dating. It's kind of like this all goes astray, and kind of like a lot of people don't get any partner. But the thing is, on a dating app, you also just, you're just surrounded by simulacra, by shadows. You don't see any, you don't encounter real people. There's no reality there. And so it is with many things, unfortunately, in our economy. Many things you buy, they lack, these are non-things, they lack the sense of realness. You throw them away the next day, you don't care for them. And I think you just have to compensate, in a sense, in your competition, you have to compensate it. And we just, we go just for cheaper goods, and we just, we lower the price and we exploit the workers to produce more and more. But I think as soon as we find, this is so platonic, right? As soon as we can find the way out and we find a point of realness, I think many things will just, they will get solved by themselves. I have this great hope that when I really have, when we because I often buy things according to realness. I even how I kind of my motivations go. I'm so attuned to that. It's like I want to buy red. In Japan, I often went to to these flea markets, and I bought teacups from real potters. Just I want to have real things. I don't want to have kind of like simulacra of any sort. And even when you have it like traditional handicraft, I think competition must not necessarily devolve, because every artist, every craftsperson brings in his or her own personality and style into the art. And I don't have to necessarily say, this is better than the other. I can have a kind of competition that's kind of really mutually acknowledging and respectful, you know. This is also, I think, with religions and philosophy, especially with religions, you know, when you just say, oh, my religion is better than, you know, I'm a Christian and my Christianity must be the only truth and Buddhism is just, you know, a lot of crap, then the dialogue doesn't work. So it's with dialogos, right? You have to let each other be. I think that's really something we have to learn. And when I can, for example, when I say I'm a Westerner, but I can acknowledge the realness of Eastern philosophy, that this is really a good attempt in, you know, finding this point of realness, the way out of the Platonic cave, then I can acknowledge it as an attempt, and I have respect for it, and we can have a dialogue that's respectful and mutually acknowledging. And I think that should be the case with many things, you know, when we have a point of realness and perhaps a shared common goal as a community, then I think we can compete in a more peaceful way. You know, we're not frightened when somebody is better than ourselves. I think with soccer players, it's always cool, you know, there is of course competition, but they all acknowledge, you know, often Messi and Ronaldo as the, you know, the best. And even, you know, with really highly skilled players can acknowledge that without envy, because they ultimately, what unites them is the love for the game and not the love for themselves. And that's often, I really like it when I see it, that somebody has a love for the game, and then you can say, I'm not the best and somebody else is much better than I am, because it's the love, you know.
I think what you're getting at is very important, because although there's a fear that if people seek excellence, they're going to become egotistical because look at me, what actually ends up happening is that a shared community of excellence then has a mutual respect. And there's actually a kind of like, wow, look at you. Wow, look at you. I'm beholding something beautiful. And that's where excellence is very important, a seeking of excellence, but the excellence is found not in, here's the issue, like the culture tends to define excellence as you won, right? What kind of is critical to understand is you can win and suck. Like you can just win. Like there's no necessary correlation between winning and excellence, right? Excellence is a matter that is kind of indifferent to the winning almost. It is the excellence for its own sakes, because there's kind of a notion that in order for life to have meaning, there has to be something in your life that's good for its own sake, right? And there's a pursuit of kind of excellence, of say excellence of craft, excellence of relation, excellence of person, precisely because that is beautiful, because that is good and that is true. And that is a much more robust category than say happy, I'm happy. There's a seeking of excellence, but it's for the sake of being able to attune with other people to make possible what happens in the dialogos or creatively, and so on and so on and so on. And so if your metric is creation and excellence is defined in the ability to create or to emerge, well, that's very different than defining excellence as having the most wins. And arguably, having the most wins is then a control mentality as opposed to a letting be mentality, because you're defining excellence as making sure reality happens in a way that you're victorious, right? So it's an entirely different, say, competitional mindset, when instead you're saying, the reason I need competition is in order to achieve an excellence that then participates in an attunement that makes possible that Trinitarian structure that otherwise is not possible, versus saying, I need competition to prove I'm better than other people. That's entirely different ways of thinking about competition. And what's kind of funny enough is you truly do see, once you get to a certain level of excellence, they almost like get competition that way. It's funny. It's not that it's like, it's true excellence that kind of understands competition is that, and there's a mutual respect that begins to flow through the competition. It's actually funny enough, rivalrous competition is often a result of a lack of excellence, not the result of people trying to be excellent. It's almost like people trying to win versus be excellent. So that's kind of the difference. You got to think about it. And actually, what then, funny enough, is you basically get a kind of game B setting through game A if the true metric of game A is excellence, right? Like, but you have to go through game A, I think, actually. Like, you can't skip game A. And that almost, to me, is where I'm trying to figure out, again, Deleuze and Hegel, where it's almost like in Deleuze, you skip the negativity by intuition of essential difference, where in Hegel, you have to tarry with the negativity. Now, I'd have to explain all that. I'm not sure, but there seems to be a difference there. Now, I will say the ontology of Deleuze basically makes everyone a work of art. Like, every single individual is their own work of art in the one of oneness, in a certain creative expression, a certain duration, as Bergson would say. That is the only one that would ever be. And that's remarkably beautiful in exactly how we need to think, that every person is a work of art, because the way you would then value them would be very, very different. It's kind of like C.S. Lewis says in The Weight of Glory, you've never met a mere mortal. Everyone you've met is either gods or goddesses or maybe demons. Everyone is like, when you meet a human being, it's more like you're basically meeting Apollo, you just don't know it, or you're meeting Venus and you don't know it. And it's a powerful image. And I think Deleuze's ontology is that. The issue I'm trying to figure out is the epistemological differences, which, I'm not sure. But it seems to me as if you have to work through the negative, like you have to work through the temptation to just win versus be excellent precisely to get the excellence. Like, that's part of the negativity you have to work through.
It's right. This is this thing with, we are developmental creatures. We start out in the cave.
Yes.
We don't have the eye of charity that can behold the individual godlike quality in every person.
Right.
We have to cultivate and the better our institutions, our educational institutions, and the more we can let art and philosophy, how the more this is a part of our lives, and we have opportunities to cultivate those let's say faculties, then I think that the easier the way out will be. But we are always trapped in the cave in the first place. I think there's no way of getting around it, and that's always the great danger in all of this, especially in a time of this, where suddenly the sight of being and then the emergence of simulacra, appearances, shadows, false idols, and so on, is so strong.
Right.
Yeah, I will just say, I will give you the last word, then I will go.
Yeah, I'm losing my throat. I can feel. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate working through all of the technical electrical glitches and different things. I appreciate very much, but no, I think if we view everyone as a kind of work of art, and then we see our work as something like a conditioning and development of excellence, like an artistic craft. And then we see the point of that as to make possible things to come out in relations that otherwise couldn't come out. All of that brings about a different conception of the role of the human being. And then all of that would also transform nothingness into nothingness. It would transform what we are interpreting as nihilism as evidence of something apophatic. And I think that's going to be, as just a closing note, I think that's going to be super, 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 super important as, say, AI technology starts doing everything humans do, as it's able to show that it can do whatever an individual can do better. Well, then that's going to be like in the same way that groundlessness has forced us to seriously consider the intersuppositional. Likewise, AI is basically the one thing AI may not be able to do that only humans can do is experience nothingness versus nothingness. AI is stuck with 1 and 0, right? 1 0 1 0 kind of a binary thinking, right? It can do pretty extraordinary things with that. But can AI make nothingness nothingness? Can AI create a dialogous situation? I think we'll see. Maybe I don't want to say it never can, but right now it cannot. And so AI is going to make us feel very insignificant. It's only going to add to the feelings of being expendable that nihilism has done. So there's only going to be even more reason to desperately move to intersuppositional and relational and no-thingness thinking, because if you do, basically the stakes are just getting higher. Like the stakes were already really bad with nihilism that made people fall into the meaning crisis. Well, now AI is coming where it's going to be even more difficult to wonder why humans are significant and what can they do if at the end of the day we don't have a ground and it's just nihilism, right? Well, if human beings are the necessary condition that makes possible no-thingness, then they have meaning. Then they're not replaceable by AI, and they have a role. And also, if they can engage in creative emergent possibilities that AI cannot, I don't think AI can create what humans can do.
That's the important point.
Then that means the role of humans to feel like they're significant in wake of and in light of AI, it's going to be cultivating this stuff. Otherwise, what's going to happen is worse nihilism, or people are going to try to like declare war on AI. They're going to destroy it all. Or you're going to have like, let's merge with AI in a sort of like idealistic sense. You're not going to have, a mature response, frankly, or a human response. You're not going to have a human response.
Yeah, that's perhaps the danger, right?
Yes.
That's a danger.
Absolutely.
My solution would be much simpler, right? Just, we shouldn't teach kids, just, that they accumulate information.
That's right.
What you said before, like half an hour ago, just, learning to have a dialogue, learning to enjoy also, because I don't think an AI can be in imaginal worlds and experience it, this whole imaginal universe that we are dwelling in as children. I don't think that. I'm sure that's not the debate for thinking beings, but when we really inspire children, I think, to be creative and artistic and encourage them really to be that, then, and also to give them a kind of sense for the philosophical and religious traditions, and not just teach them math and the hard sciences, then that would be a very simple solution, I think, and that could really bring us a lot of, could bring again a flourishing in culture. Thank you for the conversation. It was marvelous.
It was. I enjoyed it. Yeah, it made me think it's almost easier for AI to be adults than children. So cultivating childlikeness is going to be a big deal. It kind of made me think of that. The conversation was marvelous. I'm glad we were able to work through everything. I appreciate your time. I always enjoy speaking with you. And thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Mr. Zaruba. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you as well.
Absolutely. Well, have a good evening, Mr. Zaruba. All the best to you, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.